What we see now is that women are asking just as often as men do, but we're successful only half as often. And that is because we are not being taught to negotiate as a woman. And so I think this kind of give up thing comes from that same place of nervousness.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Women Worldwide. Thank you so much for tuning in and for being here. Today's episode is all about negotiating as a woman. I sat down with Kathryn Valentine, who is a speaker. She's a coach. She works with companies to help their professional women be better negotiators. And she shared so much advice. Our discussion focused on her principles of negotiation. There's 3 of them for women, and then a 9-step framework that you can actually walk away with and use in your negotiations moving forward. Kathryn discussed some of the myths around negotiating, the statistics, the data, the differences between men and women and how they negotiate, and also the common mistakes that women make. Well, I could go on and on about Kathryn, but I think it's time she shares her journey and advice with you. Kathryn, hello, welcome. Welcome to Women Worldwide.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm just so excited to chat with you.
Well, me too, because I feel like this topic of negotiating is always there. even if you think that you're getting better at it, or maybe you don't, you need more help, it's starting to be talked about more in circles. So clearly we need help. And that's why we're going to lean on you in this episode. And I always start out with, maybe you could just share what led you to your research and this approach to help women in their negotiations.
Sure. So I spent a little bit over a decade sort of working in a traditional sense, not on negotiation. And I did, when I was in business school, I did an internship, and the goal of the internship is always to like get that job offer at the end. And I was so honestly excited and proud of myself because the assignment that they had given me 3 full months to do, I finished in about 3 weeks. And so I needed to, go back and ask for another assignment. And I remember being so excited about this conversation because I was going to get to show them how much value I was delivering, and I was going to get something new and meaty to kind of bite into. And that was going to put me in a really good position to get that full-time job. Unfortunately, what happened is that and now later I see it, but I negotiated like a man. So the night before I Googled, like, how do you negotiate? And I took all that advice. And I went in and did that. And I didn't understand what was happening when I was, when that backlash that generated impacted my career. And so it ended with, you're not quite a culture match, or you didn't get that great assignment, or whatever it is, right? We're talking about sort of 2nd generation gender bias things. And I realized at that point in time that the conversation I had, that negotiation, really did derail my career at that company. However, I think was in this really special spot where I had another year of business school left. And so I went back. I went to Kellogg at Northwestern, and I went back and I spent a full year studying what had just happened to me. Right? Like really researching. I went in with all of these negotiation principles that I have been taught, but it had the opposite outcome. Why is that? And what I ended up finding out, I was shocked. 2 things. One, that negotiation is being talked about as if it's a gender neutral skill, but it's actually a highly gendered skill. All the research shows that the strategies and approaches that you would use are interpreted through a gender lens, and therefore should be moderated based on what gender you are. And we can kind of dive into that. The second thing that surprised me is that there actually is a solution here, right? So I went through about 60 academic studies out of Harvard and Georgetown and Columbia and these amazing schools where these researchers were very clear on what the solution is. I just felt like it hadn't been connected from the academic world into the sort of practical world that I was living in. And so what I try to do now is just make that connection. I mean, I really just communicate the best research coming out of these incredible places in an attempt to try and help women negotiate more effectively.
This is fascinating because just what you said, you can picture, I mean, I've done it myself. You hop on Google when you want to learn something and you grab the how-tos, but that gender lens, and it also speaks to using who you are and your gender as a way to embrace.
Well, and how much more authentic is that
exactly
to you, right? I have so many women come to me and say, I can't negotiate because it's just not who I am. And it's like, well, I understand why you would think that based on how, the media talks about it and what you get on Google, but let me show you this other path. A lot of what, kind of still gets to me is think about all those women out there who are working really hard, who are trying really hard, and to their credit, take the time to Google, how do I have this conversation, right? They put that extra thought and effort into it. And none of the advice out there has the disclaimer, this is only going to work if you're a man, right? So we are giving women, a bazooka that's like aimed at you. Because we know that statistically speaking, you're much more likely to suffer backlash than men are. And we're not telling women that this advice isn't gender neutral. And I think that is a real failure on the point of all of these quote unquote gurus who are giving out advice.
Interesting. There's something about knowing your own value, I suspect. And you hear a lot about this imposter syndrome where professionals with years and years of experience and talent and books and speaking are still feeling like they're not able to sometimes get exactly what they want, or they're undervaluing. How does a woman, what are the steps so that you can fully embrace that you are a woman, you show up with your authentic self and get your value? How do you do that? What are some of the first steps?
Gosh, I love that question. So let me just say that everything that you just said is backed up by the research, right? So there's a couple of really interesting studies on this stuff, sort of pay allocation studies, in terms of they invite people into the lab and say, okay, do this work. And then you do the work and they say, okay, how much would you pay yourself for that work? How much do you pay him for that work? That kind of thing. And what they find is that women on average undervalue themselves by about 30%. But women are actually really good predictors of what someone else is worth. Whereas men tend to overvalue themselves.
No surprise.
Undervalue, right? But actually undervalue what other people are worth by about 20%. Women are actually spot on. It's almost like we have this, amazing computer running in the background. And so my advice for women is always, when you're trying to think about that market value, is do your benchmarking, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But then once you have some sense of it, think about what you would advise a friend in your situation with your exact experience and resume in exactly the role that you were talking about. What would you say they are worth? And what we find is when we make that little mental flip, you actually end up getting a very accurate answer.
That's such great advice. Can you just touch on that benchmarking? Because while we're on it, I think it would be really good for the Women Worldwide audience to hear this.
Yeah, sure. So we have kind of a 9-step, we call it the Worth More Way process of how women want to think about negotiating. But when you're thinking about benchmarking specifically, what I would say is there's kind of, 3 sources that I would think about. The first one is who you know. So people who have left the company are really good sources of information. Recruiters are great sources. A lot of alumni career services are now collecting data on alumni salaries that can be great. So who you know When you do that, make sure you ask some white men, because we know that they're just making more. And the other part of that, we'll talk about this in a little bit, is make sure that you're not just asking about salary. So we know that the gender, pay gap is about 82 cents to the dollar, but the gender stock gap is actually about 20 cents to the dollar, right? So there was the Wall Street Journal did this really interesting article where on average, women are getting about $22,000 in stock options and men are getting $100,000 in stock options. And so when you're doing the benchmarking, we don't just want to benchmark salary, we want to benchmark all aspects of compensation and also the things that help you progress in your career, right? So if you want to be a VP, do we know that everyone else that was promoted ran a P&L first? Do we know that they all spent time in Asia? Do we know that, what are these other things that we can benchmark and learn that help us progress? So number one, who you know. Number two, I do think that kind of noodling your way through the internet is helpful. I would say that most of the sources out there are self-reported data. So any compensation expert is not going to accept it. It's notoriously off, but it's a great place to start and to spend, a few minutes. And then the last thing that I would say that I'm seeing more and more people do is just reach out on LinkedIn to somebody in a similar role at a different company and say, hey, I'm, looking for, I think I'm going to be promoted, or I'm having my end of year conversation. I think this is the right range. What do you think? And that line, I think this is the right range. What do you think, is also great if you're reaching out to your network, because you're not asking somebody, what do you make? You're asking them to interpret for you, does this seem right? And what I find is that 80% of the time they tell you what they make anyway, but it's a helpful way to get a sense of that.
These are really good benchmarks. When you go into the negotiation, let's say it's around your compensation package and it includes the stock options and everything you should be looking at, what do you think are some of the most common mistakes that a woman might make?
That's an interesting one. So here are the most common mistakes I see women making. One is we don't see the opportunity to negotiate, or we don't take it. I think a lot of times, if you find yourself complaining to friends or just wanting more, those are opportunities to proactively negotiate. The second thing, relatedly, is I see women wait and make negotiation a defensive move as opposed to an offensive move. So when your back's against the wall, you have been unhappy in the situation for years, whatever, you're just not coming from a position of strength. I really encourage women to think of it as on an annual cadence, right? So around your midpoint review every year, it's a question of, what are your goals for yourself? What are you excited about? What do you see? And then having that midpoint review where you say, hey, here's what I've been able to deliver to the company. Here's what gets me really excited. I would love the opportunity to be promoted to director, or I would love the impact that I could deliver by running a P&L. And then use the phrase, what would I need to demonstrate over the next 6 months to prove that I'm ready for that opportunity? And that's how you use negotiation offensively, right? We're using it to get more information, and then we can play that back to people and see kind of the careers progressing. Other mistakes I see women make, is negotiating only one issue because they think it keeps it easy for other people. When we talk about the principles of negotiating as a woman, we'll kind of get in this a little bit deeper. But when you negotiate just one issue, it is automatically set up as an aggressive, competitive battle because there's going to be a winner and a loser. When we negotiate multiple issues, we can set it up as a collaborative discussion where, you value my start date very highly. I don't care as much, but I value my bonus very highly. And we can trade off against that so that we're both coming out as winners, right? The other one I see is undervaluing ourselves, which we talked about. The other thing I see is assuming that a negotiation is a one-time conversation. We know with some work coming out of Harvard by a woman named Hannah Riley Bowles is that the average negotiation lasts 28 days. When we're negotiating these big things around promotions, pay, careers, these are really important. And a lot of times they deserve more than a 45-minute discussion. They deserve people to have time to think about it. So I've had a couple clients who are like, oh, I failed. We didn't come to a conclusion. It's like, oh no, this is how this goes.
Do you think that women give up a little bit too easy? I mean, just that time frame. It's not the 45-minute discussion. And maybe once it gets to a certain point, something makes us feel as if, oh, it's not going the right way. I'll just give in to this.
I love that question. I wouldn't phrase it exactly that way. So here's, there was sort of a feeling in the negotiation circles, call it 10 years ago, that women weren't asking. And that is one of the contributing factors to the pay gap. What we see now is that women are asking just as often as men do, but we're successful only half as often. And that is because we are not being taught to negotiate as a woman. And so I think this kind of give up thing comes from that same place of nervousness, which is that we know women are much more likely to suffer backlash. I'm sure we all know stories of friends or colleagues who have.
Right.
And so I think we have a little bit of a spidey sense, even for women who aren't deep in the research. I think there's a spidey sense that says, ooh, danger, be careful here. And that spidey, I mean, that is very real. If you negotiate competitively, and we'll talk about these differences in a second, but if you negotiate sort of the traditional way, you are opening yourself up to backlash, and that is very scary. And so I think this kind of give up idea sometimes comes from we've bolstered ourselves up to have that conversation, and then we have a little spidey sense that maybe it's time to let it drop.
Got it.
And if you have the conversation the way that I'm going to recommend using these principles, the risk of backlash is virtually zero. And so you can push a little bit harder. But if you were to have it, Google and have it a traditional way, I think in many senses that giving up is self-protection. It is knowing that this has been interpreted differently than we intended, and that it's starting to have some real risk associated with it.
Can you share more about the principles? I think that would be really helpful.
I would love to. So there are two main principles of negotiating as a woman, and a third one that I've just learned over time that I want to toss in there. The first one is to have a holistic negotiation. So we're not just going to ask for a pay increase, right? We want to talk about a pay increase, our hours, and additional training that's going to help us deliver more on the job. We want to talk about, a whole, like, take a step back. If you had a magic wand, what are the things that you would want? And we're going to pick and choose like 3 to 5 of those and try and negotiate them, right? So one is a holistic negotiation. The second one is a collaborative approach. So if you really boil it down to the most basic, there's kind of 2 ways to negotiate: competitively and collaboratively. Currently, men can be equally successful negotiating either way, although my hypothesis is that's changing over time as we become sort of more collaborative as a society. But right now, women are significantly more successful when we negotiate collaboratively. And what that means is, instead of it being a you versus me discussion, it's an us versus the problem. So we both want me to be able to contribute as much as I can to the company and whatever it is, right? And so let's figure out what's standing in our way on that, and let's solve that together.
That's brilliant.
And the women that I work with say that it feels much more authentic to who they are, which means that they not only are better at it, but they're much more likely to do it. We also know that it has better outcomes for women than a competitive approach. And most importantly, in a competitive approach, there's a high risk of backlash for women. In a collaborative approach, not only is the risk of backlash very low, but the people you negotiate with think more highly of you after the negotiation, because it really showcases those leadership skills. And then the third principle, which I call the golden rule of negotiating as a woman, is the communal ask. You also see it in the research called a relational ask. But this is explaining how what you are asking for is better not only for you, but for others. And what I have found in the coaching work is that many women are often considering what the impact of their actions are on other people. What the communal ask does is, by simply verbalizing that thought, we've now significantly increased how successful we can be, right? And so there's a little formula we put with that, which is that your past performance plus the future vision plus your ask and then stop talking. We do see that in an attempt to make everyone comfortable, women sometimes will continue talking and negotiate against themselves, right? So what this would look like if you're, if you're asking for something is, instead of saying, oh gosh, this Wall Street Journal article came out in January where they recommended people say, I deserve more pay. And it's like, oh, please don't say that. Say, this past year, I was able to contribute X. We're on track to contribute 20% more this quarter. In order to continue to deliver that impact, I wanted to talk to you about a 20% increase to bring me up to market rate. I wanted to see if you would be willing to pay for me to take this additional financial course at, whatever. And I wanted to talk to you about adding a person to the team so that I can focus on the highest value tasks. What do you think about that? Now we can have a conversation.
That is so helpful because you are taking away all the scary parts.
I hope so.
You're taking away the scary parts. You're making it more natural, authentic, and from a proactive, not a defensive stance, it becomes easier. I really, have you seen this? Have you, with your clients, are you seeing them reap the benefits? I remember reading somewhere in your materials that you could maybe even get up to 20%. So
our average right now is a 28% increase. The highest we've gotten is 84. We've had a couple of 74s, 84s. So there's there's like a 9-step process we walk people through. Would it be helpful if I shared that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So what we did is we took all the research on negotiation strategy, and then we took all the research on gender and negotiations, which thank God there are like 4 or 5 researchers in that world that are just killing it. They are churning out incredible things. And we fuse that together to sort of 9 practical steps because a lot of negotiation books or whatever will say like, here's the advice. And it's like 40 or 50 different things. And when you're in this conversation, there's no way to mentally look up all of those different tidbits of advice, right?
Right.
We wanted to put it into a strategy, which is a lot of what I just gave you, right? Negotiate holistically, the collaborative negotiation and the communal ask. But then we also wanted to break it into steps for people that are a little bit more process oriented.
Mm-hmm.
So step 1 is to brainstorm multiple issues. And my favorite question there is, if I were to give you a magic wand, what does your career look like in a year? And from there, you can kind of deduce a few, right? The second step is to collect your data, which is a lot of what we were talking about earlier.
Doing your homework.
Yeah. And it's not an easy thing to do. I do feel like there's a number of negotiation experts that are like, oh, just hop on Glassdoor. Well, it's not that easy.
Right.
And I would make sure that when you're benchmarking, you benchmark not just compensation, as we said, but anything else that you think you're going to negotiate. And then you want to set your target and your reservation points. What is the point at which you would rather just walk away? And then what is like the highest thing you could dream for, like you're jumping up and down on the couch number or moment or package, right? We want to set those before we get into the conversation, because once you start, emotions can really take hold. If you do it earlier, we find that people can be a little bit more truer to what's important to them. And then you craft your ask using that formula we talked about. The next step is to practice. So this is step number 5. And I would say this is the most undervalued step. I myself hate to do this, but we know that when you practice, you have better results. Right.
Sure.
So practicing it with somebody. Step number 6 is setting yourself up for success. This is just some of those fun sort of, if you can prime yourself with happiness, we know that your negotiation goes better, right? So like listen to your favorite song, get your favorite coffee, talk to your best friend, and then have the conversation, or at least part 1 of it, right? As we know, it might last a few days. And then step number 8 is to follow up. So after each stage of that conversation, you want to send a note that says, thank you so much for your time. Here's where I think here's what we agreed on, or here's where I think we are, and just recap it. And then, did I miss anything? And the reason why we want to do that is because as life gets as busy as it is, it's possible that you have a conversation and then, it needs to be translated to HR to adjust things. Or it's possible we have the conversation and then 3 weeks later, when we come back to it, we've forgotten some of those particulars. So we want to make sure we're creating a paper trail. And then step 9, which is my favorite, is reward yourself.
Nice.
So I learned this from just one of the most incredible negotiation gurus, a woman named Victoria Medvac. But before you have the conversation, plan what your reward's going to be. A bottle of wine you've always wanted, a hike with your best friend, an afternoon off, right? Whatever it is. And then immediately after the conversation, enjoy that reward. That's not because you achieved X or Y. It's just because you were brave enough to have that conversation. Yeah. And so knowing that is coming afterwards, we actually see that people have a better experience because they're primed for happiness in that way. So those are the 9 steps.
They are so helpful. I mean, what a framework. Thank you so much for sharing these. I think that there's a whole bunch of women right now watching who are going to put this to task, because it from start to finish, it sets you, even though one of them is setting you up for success, this whole framework sets you up for success with even an reward at the end. Mm-hmm. And you can make this muscle memory in a way. You can do this process as something that just becomes natural. And as soon as it does, you're in that flow and everything must get so much easier.
Which is what we see, this sort of virtuous trajectory almost, where women negotiate things that allows them to be happier, more satisfied, more engaged, and therefore deliver more, which puts them in a position to negotiate more the next time.
That is great. Well, just a maybe quick story I would love to hear, because I'm fascinated by what professionals share when I ask this. Can you maybe just share one aha moment or an moment that really has shaped who you are and what you do? Now, I know you shared the first story in the beginning, but was there anything else along the way that's really stuck with you?
There is, and it's one that I've been surprised to see in many of our clients. So I was probably 27 when this happened. I worked for this incredible woman named Michelle, who was just, those bosses that make everyone like 6 times better. She was just, she was one of a kind, amazing. We had a great year, and the initiatives that I worked on had delivered $2 million in value to the company, which we could track. And so I went in to do like my annual review, and she looked at me and she said, "What do you want?" And I didn't have an answer. Right? Which is that moment where you're like, oh, she was handing it to me on a silver platter.
Right. What do you want?
And I didn't know. I was too busy doing the work that I had forgotten to think about me. And I see that in women a lot, right?
I could see that.
And taking care of others and all the things. And so that's, that for me is one of those things where I love to start the negotiation with, what is your dream? What are you excited about? And I have some women who there's a certain number. I have other ones, there's a certain level. I have, I'm working with a few that I really adore who, for them, it's around time to be the caregiver they want to be, that like genuinely fires them up. And it's like, great, let's do that. Let's talk about how we make that happen. So anyway, that's mine.
That's a great story. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I can't even believe I'm going to ask you to give parting advice, even though this entire discussion has been jam-packed with so much advice, Kathryn, and I can't thank you enough for that. Is there just one thing you want to leave the Women Worldwide listeners with?
There is. So I think that, one of the things we talked about at the top of this episode was that I felt like there was a missing piece where if I was a woman who wanted to get negotiation guidance, there literally wasn't anywhere to go aside from digging through thousands and thousands of pages of academic research, right? And no one's going to do that the night before their discussion. So we have built a ton of resources that we have made free and freely available. And so I would, for any of your listeners, please go to worthmorenegotiations.com. So WORTHMORE negotiations.com. And if you click at the top, you can download our list of 75 things you can negotiate for.
Amazing.
And then that will also kind of put you into our bucket, our email bucket. And every month we send out new resources. So you'll get, a free online course that we used to charge a few $100s for. And now it's like, we just want everyone to have it. You will get information on how to go into your midpoint review, how to negotiate salary, how to figure out what it is that drives you. So we've set up kind of this 12-month experience that we would love for people to partake in. So again, it's worthmorenegotiations.com, and just download the 75 things that you can negotiate, or click to sign up for our email list.
I know there's a lot of people who have lots of reading to do, and I hope that they check out the website and all the free resources and sign up to get new monthly resources as well. Is there anywhere else you want people to find you? Website, social media?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. And I also have to share, simply because our discussion has gone a different way. The first 10 years of this was all about like one-to-one coaching. And now 90% of our business is working with companies who hire us to teach women to negotiate, because it enables them to retain more women. And right now, the companies who are poised to win are the ones that are able to retain diverse talent.
That's
right.
right.
And so to the extent that that is helpful for anyone, that's the bulk of what we're doing right now. And it is just so fun to go into these companies who, can you imagine? I never would have thought this would have happened, but the companies who care enough about their talent to empower women to negotiate, because they know that that helps them keep more women.
Unbelievable. Well, we certainly appreciate you and all of the work that you're doing. And I'm sure these companies realize the tremendous value that you're bringing to those women. It's amazing.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to come chat with you today.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank all of the Women Worldwide listeners and people who are watching this show. Thank you for always tuning in. And what I always say is keep the conversation going and the feedback coming. You know where to find me. I'm at Dee Breckenridge on Twitter, and you can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. Okay, friends, until our next episode, stay focused, energized, and feeling empowered. Thank you.